San Joaquin Valley, who thought this was really great and we were going to get lots of water. And in fact, to the credit of Metropolitan Water District, they never said that that's what was going to happen associated with the Two Gates project, but it took on a life of its own. And we had people chasing this down. Assembly Joint Resolution 38, SB 1, they all have it in there. It's a proposed early, actually it's a stated early action. That's amazing. Then we had, of course, before that in 2006, we had a flood. And suddenly, shockingly, we woke up to the fact that our levees were in pretty bad shape. Crisis science time. So what did we do? The legislature says, I want you to go out and choke $15 million down really quickly, and in a year and a half, do a comprehensive evaluation of flood risk in the Delta. Many of you know this is the Delta Risk Management Strategy, DREAMS. I've been always wanting to write the paper, The Nightmare of Dreams, because they were asked to do too much with too much money in too little time, and it was crisis science. And both those kinds of examples that I give you have this, you pull your infrastructure, your science, you pull people off of your science infrastructure to deal with these crises, and everything else suffers in between. So some stability in all this is actually a critical feature. The next issue is Rita has already referred to. I have a good friend and colleague who has asked to remain nameless, but his initials are J. Lund, who often points out to me that when you hear a politician call for sound science, what they're really looking for is science that sounds good. And that is indeed true. If you have been involved in the Delta for any number of time, you are always amazed at that. When you hear that phrase, your ears should perk up like my dog does when it's time for a treat. Sound science. When I hear the phrase sound science, particularly coming out of a politician, I know something's up. And what that means is they don't like the sound of the science they're hearing, and they would like it to sound different. So beware of the sound science, and we've had some really good examples of this. And of course, the most important example is what happened with biological opinions in the Delta. Now, do not mistake my comment as saying those were perfect. There were plenty of warts in the biological opinions for the Delta. But the fact is, very important, powerful people did not like the sound of the science. So they asked the National Research Council to come up with science that sounded different. And they didn't, which was probably a great disappointment to them at the time. When they reviewed the biological opinions, which everybody forgets, the National Research Council at the time said, you know, it's based on, it's adequate. That's the best way it could be described. They didn't give it glowing praise, but it was adequate. But they didn't really knock it back. So we reverted to sound science from a judge who has a degree in English, I think. But that's the way we're doing the sound science in this system. This is getting to a broader point. Again, destined to annoy everybody in some way, shape, or form. But this sound science calls, and this happens all the time in the legislature, you have to be very careful. A variant on sound science, or science that sounds good, comes from, of course, the famous quote that all of you used in some way from Harold Mencken. That is, for every complex problem, there is a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong. And this is part of the sound science problem we have, particularly in the Delta. We have sound science sound bites, which is the communication of science. When Phil Eisenberg, all the unkind things said about us scientists, particularly out of the Delta Blue Ribbon Task Force. Let's see, I won't remember which board members were saying, I won't tell you which board members were saying this, but I was chewed out in public for being a member of the priesthood. One board member referred to scientists as testicularly challenged, is the best way I could describe it. And then, of course, I had a senator yell at me for being a weasel. But we're dealing with trying to reduce these nuanced, complex arguments into single sound bites. This is a tough job. Our scientific adhocracy is part of the problem. It's the chaos that it rolls around, but the demand for simple sound science. So phrases like more water is better for fish. Well, that's not true. There's good examples where it's not better for fish, especially in some places where that water is warm and green. More water is not necessarily better for fish. One that I know bothers some of you in this room. If we get rid of the things that eat salmon, salmon will do better. It's not that simple. If only it was that simple. Or the one that got us in so much trouble in the managing California water, agricultural conservation will increase water for everyone. I'm happy to talk to you more about that at the end if you like, but we sure got beat up on that one in particular. These are oversimplifications of complex, nuanced problems. That's part of the issue we're dealing with in sound science. So let me go on to the one that will cause Byron a fair amount of stomach acid in all of this, since Byron's already been identified. And I started this last fall by highlighting this in a couple of comments. We are seeing a steady escalation in combat science in the Delta and throughout California. This is nothing new. Combat science has been around since the wars over hydraulic mining in California. There was combat science involved in that. And so it's a necessary part of doing science in this system. I remind you what combat science really is. It's the selective use of facts, is my definition. Selective use of facts or analyses to advance the political or legal position of one group and or to the disadvantage of another. And so that's a pretty broad definition. The point is, it's not science. It's not the classic empirical assemblage of information, the development of a hypothesis, the testing of that hypothesis in multiple ways, which of course is key in this system. You have to test these hypotheses in multiple ways. The testing of that hypothesis again and again before it moves into theory, and in fact you feel comfortable with using it for management. That's typical science. Combat science, of course, is not like that. It's not science, because the object of combat science is to win. It's not to advance the science. Oh, there'll be lots of complaining. No, we're trying to advance the science. But what they mean to say is we're trying to advance the science in our favor. That's what combat science is, and it comes in many forms. Okay. In fact, it comes in. Usually there's some combat science you can spot right away, and you know exactly what it is. It's no problem. And by far, the best example of difficult to identify and easy to identify combat science comes from the great dust up over ammonium from Sac Regional Sewage Treatment Plant. This is one of those hot button issues that gets people very upset, but it did boil down to combat science. As we all know, that Glibbert's paper, the University of Maryland paper, was funded by Metropolitan Water District. As one member of Metropolitan Water District said, it's the best $60,000 I've ever spent on science. And what it did is it did what CalFed had been trying to do several years before. CalFed did it in its own gentle way, a series of workshops to explore the idea of how ammonium disrupts food webs in the Delta. But Pat's paper zinked right in and said this is the cause of decline of Delta smelt, and you need to reverse this in order to bring the smelt back. I will tell you, the bulk of the scientific community thinks that has been overstated in that regard, and you'll see a whole lot more over the course of the next year about that, because the scientific community will start winding up and really arguing over this in published peer-reviewed format, which is what Pat Glibbert's was. But it was a form, probably the purest and best form of combat science. Real combat science was the answers that came back from Sac Regional, which was very impressive as combat science goes. So, withering fire, I think, is the best way to describe it. It was really very, very interesting to read. No doubt about it, that was combat science. And in the end, as you all know, the regional board told Sac Regional that they have to basically reduce their ammonium to the levels that pretty much everybody else has to deal with. The only thing that really made sure that it was combat science was the water contractors, who gloated publicly in the newspaper about that. And that, yeah, never mind. All right, so let me move on from that. Okay, so that's some of the most glaring ones, and I do want to note, and that's why Byron is here, that I poke at him now. Byron, as you may know, the state and federal water contractors have now developed their own science program with their own head scientist within it, which is better funded than the CalFed science program, by the way. And how's that going to go? All right, so at the same time that they're doing that, I've noticed just recently that several NGOs are now putting a lot of money into their science programs. And when you look at where they're going with their science programs, they're all girding for combat science. So we're going to see some combat science. Some of it will be really good, peer-reviewed, hypothesis-driven science, but with the end objective of basically trying to convince people that their choice is better. It will be combat science. Okay, well now let me get to my last two pet peeves, then you can start throwing fruit at me. Blog science. Blog science drives me nuts. So that's why I want to tell you all about blog science. And the drought emergency was great, because in that it was fertilizer to blogs. I mean, the number of blogs has sprung up since the beginning of the drought was really amazing. My favorite and best blog, of course, is the one Aquafornia, which I hope all of you pay attention to it. I'm not doing that just to be nice to my hosts here. It is my daily blog. That's what I open up. Because Chris does, well, Rita, through Chris, does a wonderful job of sorting the completely nutty blogs out.
And she gets up at 4 in the morning.
I know, so do I. I can't wait. I sit there on my computer waiting for her to upload this stuff.
This is bad.
This is bad, but you know, good cup of coffee. I encourage you, if you do not go to that blog, then you're really making a mistake. It cuts through so much. You can do DWR's news and notes, but this is very efficient, and the mashup is very good. And to Chris's credit, she tries to steer away from the really nutty blogs, the crazy stuff. Although she lets a few in.
We have an editorial policy.
Okay, well, all right. Well, Dan Batcher's calling Arnold Schwarzenegger Hitler.
No.
That should have been cut out. And, you know, the ones that use the F-bomb in the blogs shouldn't be included.
No,
but,
no.
you know, other than that, it's really good stuff, along with all the newspapers. So Chris deserves a lot of credit. That's the end of my friendly comments about blogs. I have some very unkind things to say about blogs, and normally I would just say, they're just blogs. Ignore them. Except they get quoted, and they get picked up by newspapers, and people refer to them in the legislature. So you have to pay attention to this. My least favorite blog of all are those that emanate from academic or research institutions, in particular, that blog. And the worst offenders are those that tell you they have, quote unquote, conducted analysis, whether it's economic analysis or whether it's scientific analysis, and their results say X, Y, and Z. You all know who I'm talking about. There's a couple of those in the valley here that do this. And they'll tell you about their analysis. Their analyses never see the light of day. We have no idea how they did them. We don't know whether there's some analysis. And that's all. But we pick them up. And so in this era of scientific adhocracy, which is not effectively communicating science, blog science is on the growth. I'm so upset about it, I've started a blog. And you can go to it, it's called the California Water Blog. And you can go to the UC Davis Watershed Center. But let me go to my last pet peeve, PowerPoint. As I say, 30,000 different slides, and nobody remembers any of them, mostly me. I had all these years of PowerPoint slides. When you think of science, science as you knew it when you learned it in high school, this is, again, the collection of information, the analysis of information, the writing up of that information, the review of that information, the adjustments of that information, the applications, the revisiting. It's a slow process. But things are happening so fast now that we're using PowerPoint slides as the basis of science to make decisions. It's a way of taking professional judgment, basically. I can remember some water districts screaming and yelling at us about our earlier conclusions and earlier reports, and they said, look, we've got this PowerPoint that shows X, Y, and Z. And we always go, what? What am I supposed to do with that PowerPoint? Well, they thought that was good enough science. And of course, as many of you know, in the legislature, this is a real problem.